We're joined now by Greg Perreault, a professor of digital journalism at Appalachian State University, who has studied media coverage of mass shootings. Greg, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Greg, what is right or wrong about how the media currently covers mass shootings?
I believe we're granting far too much notoriety to mass shooters. It's an easy trap to fall into in the sense that there's obviously some interest in sort of the salacious coverage of these individuals. However, we should be granting far more emphasis on victims and communities in rebuilding.
It seems like lately there's been a spate of mass shootings. What does the research say about the copycat phenomenon or the contagion effect?
There is some indication that, similar to mass media coverage of suicides, that there is a contagion effect in the sense that when one shooting event happens, there tends to be a bit of an uptick in a number of shooting events that follow. We've certainly seen this in recent days.
Do you think that's because the shooter wants notoriety, or are there other things at play? For example, I know from reading about the psychology of some of these mass shooters that they want to see their own power. They feel powerless. They want to see power exercised. So maybe they want to see, the chaos and despair, destruction that they can reap. So how much of it is, wanting the notoriety, and how much is just seeing the impact of what they can do?
I think it's a bit of both. And I think that begs us in the media to reconsider how it is that we're framing these individuals and how much coverage we grant to them as opposed to victims and the communities that are so harmed by these events.
How much coverage do you think we should be giving of mass shootings in general?
Mass shootings it depends entirely on the event, but I would say in general covering the events is completely valid in the same way that covering hurricanes is entirely valid, for as long as there are stories that need to be covered.
But do you think some of the emphasis on the shooters, because we so desperately want to understand what happened, what went wrong, how we can prevent it from happening again?
Of course, and I think that it's reasonable that we would want to focus on it for that reason. However, I think in the same way that in the case of a virus, we prevent close contact with people knowing that it could catch. I think it's incumbent on us to think of this in much the same way as something that can catch in our society.
So it's something like we don't give a lot of attention to suicide, for example, along those lines?
Exactly. So I know, for example, in university settings, we're very controlled in the amount of information we provide about suicides, in that there's significant research that shows a strong uptick in suicides that follow a report of a suicide. I think a good template that we use in journalism is in hurricane coverage. So certainly we, as is sort of nature in journalism, we need to get there to tell the story. However, the emphasis on reporting that story is on the people who are most harmed. There's very little emphasis given to where the hurricane came from. Of course, we do, share that information, and we should, certainly from official sources. However, I think that provides the best template for how we should be approaching this.
Although there is no psychology involved with a hurricane, so there are some slight differences there.
Of course.
And what do you think about sharing things like sometimes the killers will write a manifesto or leave social media postings, that sort of thing? How much emphasis do you think that should be given?
Those are designed explicitly for journalists to share, and that's part of the shooter's agenda in writing such a thing, that journalists will be sharing them and will be sharing them widely. And so I would argue, in line with no notoriety policies, that we shouldn't be sharing any of those materials, in the sense that I don't think we need to grant additional screen time to the people who have already caused undue tragedy in a community.
And what do you see, or what does the research show about the role of social media in all this? Because of course, we can control, journalists can self-police. We've already, put in ethical policies about things, but social media, there's no way to control it. So what do you see the role of social media in all of this is?
Well, certainly, you're absolutely right. That's something we can't police in journalism. However, I think we have seen social media companies do undertake a bit of filtering, and the algorithms do play a significant role in promoting certain types of stories and certain types of content as opposed to others. As appears to be the gaining role of gatekeeping in social media platforms, I think it's perhaps worth considering how that algorithm might be tweaked to de-emphasize content related to mass shooters as opposed to the communities and victims.
And you'd leave that up to social media companies, or do you think there's any role for legislation in that?
I'm hesitant about the realistic nature of legislation in that area, just because I know that that's proven to be quite problematic in the past. Would I like to leave it to social media companies in an ideal world? No. However, I think that it is perhaps the most realistic likelihood.
Has anything changed in the way we've covered as media these sorts of events over the past, I don't know, 10, 20 years?
My research with colleague Hannah Hume, one of the things we found is that in early coverage of mass shooting events, Columbine in particular, there was a much stronger emphasis on issues of morality and parenting. The parents have done something terrible to create this mass shooter, whereas more recent reports quickly shift to policy decisions, mainly related to mental health, media consumption, and of course, gun legislation.
So that's interesting, the morality or parenting part of it. I know that some people say, some researchers say that we shouldn't try to humanize the killers at all, that, you know, they're just bad people, leave it at that. Don't try to humanize them and understand it. But on the other side, of course, we do want to understand what's happening and how to prevent it. So where do you see that balance?
I see it coming from official reports. The police are going to investigate that anyway. We have authorities that investigate those things, and I would prefer that we emphasize those reports when they come out. It's inevitable that we'll be gathering that information from those sources, but I don't think it's incumbent on us to dig any deeper than that.
All right. Is there anything else that you think the media should be doing differently that we haven't already talked about?
I would just want to make sure I note that this is incredibly difficult coverage that no journalist ever wants to be covering. However, you know, I know from my experience in journalism myself, as well as extensive interviewing with journalists, that we would love to see this as something that never occurs, that never has to be reported on. And so I think that there is a role, that there is something we can do in this sense. And I think no notoriety for mass shooters is a reasonable way for us to approach this.
How do you see no notoriety playing out? Is it never mention their name, never show their picture? Is it something but a minimalist approach?
I think it's a minimalist approach. I think sharing names and faces is something that is unnecessary, except in the case of when authorities are sharing that information publicly. When it comes from an official source, I think it's incumbent on us to share that information. However, I think anything beyond that is unnecessary and potentially damaging for causing contagion for future mass shooting events.
So day one, when the shooter is identified, media can report it, but you think they shouldn't at all after that?
After that point, I think it should be discussion. I think that they could use some sort of information to say that there was a mass shooting tragedy. I don't think that there needs to be a name associated with it.
All right, Greg Perreault, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me, Cindy.